That was great. All right, everyone, we apologize. I'm Kevin Powers. I'm the director and founder of the cybersecurity programs here at Boston College. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm not sure, Tom, if anyone's going to take any of your tips now. You just showed your age that you're kind of like using the TV clicker.
Or the VCR.
Yeah, you can run a cybersecurity and privacy program for a multi-billion-dollar organization, but logging into Zoom, but no biggie. And thanks everyone for bearing with us. So before we jump in, just give you some ground rules. Again, I'm Kevin Powers. Welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar is on cybersecurity, making the business case for investment and buy-in across your organization. Ground rules, we want this to be really interactive as possible. So feel free to ask questions on the chat as we go along. We'll get to them in real time, or if we can't get to them in real time, we'll definitely get to them at the end where we'll open up for questions and answers. Learning objectives for today. This is what we're going to focus on. It's going to be this is probably the most practical webinar you will get in a long time. We're really focusing on what the threats are, and then how do you build a plan? How do you work with senior management? How do you work with mid-level management? How do you work with the enterprise, all employees and staffs, to get a strong cyber culture and cyber hygiene? So with that, I'm going to leave it no further, and I'll start with Tom Scholler, who he's like this all the time. I usually get lunch with him and he shows up 5 to 10 minutes late. So this is par for the course. So with that, Tom, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? How you got involved in cybersecurity, your current position, and then how you build up programs regarding cyber and privacy.
Perfect. So thanks, Kevin. I appreciate the time here. So I'm Tom Scholler. I work for John Hancock Manulife. And I'm not here as a John Hancock Manulife employee. I'm here as actually an alumni from the Woods College cybersecurity program. And how did I get involved in it? I've been in risk, security, cyber, fraud for years. I worked for the Royal Bank of Scotland. I worked for Santander Bank, and it just was a natural progression to start advancing, within the intelligence world, to go for my master's at the Woods College. So I highly recommend it. It gave me a big lift in my career. And thanks a lot to Kevin Powers and team. So what do I do all day? I have two hats, actually. I have a US hat, which is a cybersecurity officer for the John Hancock Retirement Services. And then I have a global hat. So I have 20 countries, including Asia, Canada, US for retirement and for wealth under the Global Wealth Asset Management in Manulife. And I'm able to leverage both sides between, the international perspective and getting that to leverage for US and the US for international. And we do everything from cybersecurity investigations, any of the data loss prevention, making sure that we're following all the regs and rules, that we're notifying customers and regulators appropriately, that we're protecting people as much as we can. And really the goal that we have within any of the cybersecurity aspects that I work with is balancing that customer experience, that expected experience, so that it's transparent from a security perspective, and giving customers that confidence in our reputation and how we're going to protect them.
All right, well, thanks, Tom. And also with us today, we have Joanna Baltus. So Joanna works here at Boston College with me. She's a curriculum director, and she co-teaches with me in the cyber policy and law course online version. So Joanna, why don't you give us a bit about your background, not only in the cyberspace, but also in the management space and dealing with business leaders to change the culture and get them to buy in.
Yeah, sure. No, thanks so much for having me. And welcome, Tom. And I'm sure it was Kevin's fault that you couldn't log in, wasn't your fault. So I don't think you should take, don't let him dish that out.
Everyone on the call pretty much knows that was my fault. Just play along.
There you go. So I spent most of my career as a federal prosecutor with the Justice, specializing in national security. So I had a lot of exposure to cyber fraud, cyber crime, particularly in the last 10 years. My last job at the Department of Justice was as chief of staff to the deputy director at the FBI. And at the time, cyber was becoming, again, much more of a focus, and it is even more so now. So really how the Bureau was running cyber, kind of what the current threats were, how to recruit for cyber were huge pieces of the job that I had when I was chief of staff. And I also helped implement policy, sometimes not really popular policy. So I was in charge of implementing a very unpopular piece of policy for all 13,000 plus special agents across the FBI in about a 6 or 7 week time frame. So sometimes it's helpful to kind of look at how your own organization reacts to things, thinking about all the different components when you're looking at trying to implement some type of a policy and actually really make it work and make people accountable. And then I obviously teach with Kevin in the cybersecurity policy class. And then one other job that has been relevant really in shaping policy and holding people accountable was running a school district. I was president of a school board. And so even though schools might not seem to be such a right target for cyber actors, everyone's vulnerable these days. So again, enacting policies both for the student side so that we're educating kids as they're kind of growing up in this different world of social media, making sure they're protecting themselves all the way through staff and senior executives is something that I've really focused on. So happy to be here, and hopefully Tom and I can walk through some really good persuasive ways to make the business case for making sure that your organization is prepared and is proactive.
Awesome. Thanks, Joanna. Thanks, Tom. So Tom, I'll lead off with you. And this is really just, we'll start with, some of the threats. And yesterday when we were preparing, you talked about, like, hey, everyone, we'll focus on the threats, but let's talk about boom, and what do you mean by that?
So I learned boom along the way when I was in the curriculum at Boston College. So think of boom as the event that happens, right? And there's certain things that are on the left side of boom. There's certain things on the right side of boom. And I think that when you're looking at a lot of the regulations, everyone's focusing on the right side. And the right side is that communication plan. Be forthright, be moral, be ethical.
Tom, when you talk about the right side, what do you mean by that? That's a post breach, right?
Yeah, it's all the communication piece, right? Mm-hmm. It's making sure that you do the outreach. And for the folks that are older, they'll remember the Tylenol scare, right, with Johnson & Johnson's. That was like the right side, right? It was making sure that they came forward and they came out and they said that there was an issue. And all the regulations initially were all focusing on communicating, telling people, making sure that everyone's aware of it. But if you've noticed in the last probably 18 months, there were a lot of events that occurred where they found out years later. So they did, when they discovered it, they followed the reg. The reg said notify right away when you discover it, but they weren't building the left side of boom. So it was, the prevent, the detect. How do you get all of that done while you're doing the right side? So it's balancing, so there's a seesaw. Make sure you're balancing the left and the right side of boom. And you need to start focusing more on that detecting and preventing so that you're able to be aware to communicate and not just focus on the right side of communication. So we can all communicate when we figure it out, right, Kev? But you're not going to actually be able to figure it out if you don't build the right structure on the side of prevent and detect and be able to put the right tools in place. And that's a big sell point because that's where the cost comes in, right? It's not on the communication plan. It's really on detecting and preventing.
Right. And is that something, now I'm going off script, when we talk about incident response, and everyone talks about incident response all the time, and everyone thinks like, hey, we need instant response. But before you get to incident response, you really have to build a program first. And that has to be part of that program. And that's what you're really talking about here about, you have to focus on the left, not just the right. If you just focus on, hey, I've been hit with, a cyber attack and there's a breach, now we're going to go game on. Well, if you're not prepared for that game and you haven't been practicing accordingly and got everyone ready for the game time, it's going to be a failure, right?
Absolutely. And you have to practice that. And that's clear. And Joanna knows, right? You practice as many times as you want and it never happens the same time or the same way. So practicing is key when you're looking at that incident response plan.
Yeah, and just following up on kind of Tom's analogy, I like the left of boom, right of boom. Although in my counterterrorism days, boom was like much bigger, like boom. But it's like anything, right? We want to be proactive, and I think that's what you're talking about is. And when you're talking about making the business case, it's a lot more expensive if you're waiting for the right of boom to happen as opposed to implementing those measures, at the left of boom. And so that's, when you're looking at numbers and looking at building your budget and trying to convince your senior executives for buy-in on what kind of investment your organization should be making, obviously, the prevention side is far cheaper. Looking at your infrastructure, looking at designing your infrastructure from the ground up is far cheaper than trying to do it kind of like on the back end after you've had an incident. And then you've got to deal with all, again, the public part of it, the communications, the client facing, all of that, where, if you're able to set up kind of that proactive program and it works, then you've got that kind of accountability. You're never going to have to kind of deal with that, or you're really reducing your risk to have to deal with that eventual potential breach.
And I think that the hard dollars are on the left, the soft dollars are on the right. Yep. It's that reputational risk, and it's the business you lose because your reputation's impacted, right? So I think that, when we're looking at selling this to the C-suite, you have to put in those soft dollars so that they actually are balancing that left side to the right side. Because if you don't, you're only going to be saying to everyone, I'm a cost center now. I'm a cybersecurity cost center. I need all of these tools. I need all of this infrastructure. I need all this dollars, but I'm not showing really what the value proposition is until I can show how it's helping my reputation, how customers are confident in my ability to protect their data, and financial perspective. So it's not a financial loss or a data loss.
And one other thing when you're making the business case to point out too is the cost on the regulation side too. So the cost of regulators once you have an incident, can also be really expensive. And that's something that with recent legislation in the last couple of years, you could really point to as a hard data point, especially if you've got customers in California, New York, so those are definitely some helpful kind of dollars and cents figures that you can throw in when you're trying to make that business case for that infrastructure, that investment in the infrastructure upfront.
Yeah, and before we get to like the business case and what that means too, because we'll define that, today's threats, and I won't beat that to death, but I think the number one threat, you tell me where I'm wrong here, Tom and Joanna, is ransomware, right? And that ties in completely to the insider threat, which is everyone often thinks of the insider threat as the nefarious employee, but more often than not, it's the negligent employee, or the employee wasn't properly trained or doesn't understand the issues. And then there's the supply chain, which we just saw with SolarWind, and we can talk more on that. And I think then it ties into the home office, which ties into all three. Would you agree with that? Is that the biggest threat you're seeing out there right now, Tom?
So I think that we're seeing that in the industry. SolarWinds is a really good example, right? Third parties, these third-party infrastructures. So a lot of folks are putting investment into the cloud, making sure that the cloud is protected, and making sure that they have the right fourth-party oversight. Because some of these third parties are really a fourth party when you get engaged. I think that and we kind of say this for team members who are looking for roles in cyber. There's a huge amount of roles in third-party risk management that focus on cyber, and it's that third and fourth party. I think people kind of forget that when they're looking at cybersecurity. They're thinking that it's the SOC and it's all of that. I think that there's a big piece on that. Third party and ransomware is definitely one of the key things, Kev.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Joanne.
No, I was going to say, and I mean, on your insider threat, of course, you've got your malicious actors on the insider threat, and those are much less common, obviously, but they can be potentially unbelievably devastating. So if you do have those, but more likely it's the reckless employees, the negligent employees, or flat out an employee that's just having a bad day, that clicks on something. And so those are really the greatest risk incidents to your organization. It's those phishing, it's the emails, it's ransomware can completely take your whole system down, and those are those malicious actors, an outside actor or potentially an insider, but much more likely an outsider. So really, it's looking at all of your different risks, and all of them have different consequences, and so it's knowing your employees, knowing your data, who could be interested in your data. Really, it's kind of nice to start thinking about that. Well, who could be interested? And so I can then go through kind of my list of what are my vulnerabilities and where do I need to make those patches.
Now, when we talk about making the business case, what do we mean by that? Tom, so I'll throw it at you. When we hear like, hey, I'm making the business case, that's great, but what do we really mean by that? And where do we talk about that? Is it just up top, or where are we going?
Yes, so it's interesting. I think a couple of years ago, it wasn't at the top, it was in the middle. And everybody in the middle was trying to just vie for that to protect their business. But I think that we've seen in some of the breaches that have occurred, the C-levels are responsible for a lot of this information. They're also the ones that are, and we've seen it, walked out, right? C-levels were walked out for covering things up, for not being forthright and transparent, and making sure that now, I think, unfortunately, that's helped in the business case, because the C-levels have a vested interest now. They're the ones who are really driving it. They're the sponsors in a lot of these companies to drive the cybersecurity programs and to put it forward.
Yeah, so we have a question here from Matt, and I was holding off on it because it ties right into that. So Matt asked, what is an effective way to convey the value proposition to a board that perceives the cost of preventive measures to be very high compared to that perception that data incidents are very rare and probably won't happen to us? Welcome to every board.
I think I just read a stat that like 42%, is it 36 to 42% of small businesses, like from 2017 to 2019, had been hit with some type of cyber attack. So I think, first of all, you better educate your senior executives or C-suite that it is not as much of a low risk incidence as maybe they think. And Tom, I'm sure you have some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, and again, so when I joke with everyone, right, and there's the F word and the B word, right? Fraud and breach. That's what it comes down to, right? And fraud is the financial crime to the data extraction of the breach. So it's educating these C-levels that it's not just about protecting the data extraction. It's where the breach might have happened somewhere else, and someone's then assuming my identity to then perpetrate the financial crime. It's both sides that we have to protect on. And when you start putting that into perspective to say someone else had a breach and then I'm ending up with financial loss to that, the C-levels are more inclined to actually put some backing to that, because they're saying, hey, there's a financial crime here. I'm going to lose finances. I'm going to have to reimburse the client or the customer. And I want to make sure I have the right tools in place to authenticate that person appropriately, right? So it's not always just about the cyber breach. It's sometimes about that financial crime. And when you start to put it into play, for Matt's question, that's key to put that value proposition for both sides and say, it's someone else's breach, but I'm going to then have the financial loss. I want to be able to put the right tools in place and make sure for that.
Now, we have a question, Joanna, you'll like this one. It's from Bill Klein. Hey, wow, we got a bunch that just came in. So first I'll get to Bill. Bill's a former student of ours. He's still in the program. Hey, Bill, Happy New Year. How do you make the economic case to the C-suite? Do you use, for instance, the average cost of a ransomware attack versus the cost of the prevention? What do you think?
I again, like the average cost, I think 2018 to 2019, it went up. It was $3.86 million in 2018, and it increased in 2019. I'm sure it increased again in 2020. This year in 2021, the estimated cost of all cyber fraud will be $6 trillion. $6 trillion. So again, to think that your business, your organization is the only one that's insulated from some random attack is ridiculous, especially when you understand how easily it is for bad actors to actually buy ransomware. It's just like going on Amazon and just purchasing a product. You buy a piece of ransomware and then you can deploy it. So I think that's helpful. I think showing the cost, but also, as Tom mentioned, it's your reputation, and so it's one thing if you're a company that's done a lot, that you have a culture of cyber hygiene and you get hit, I mean, look at FireEye, look at the US government, look at SolarWinds, like nothing probably was going to prevent that. But if you're not doing anything, if you're not doing the basics, and there's a lot of really good basics out there, it just looks bad. And the basics are not that expensive. Yes, you can start making like expensive investments, but if you are a company that has sensitive data, and the more sensitive the data, the more concerned you should be about making sure that you are making that investment.
And Joanna, this actually supports everything you're saying right here. This is from the IBM breach report. And if you look here, here's the value adds are in green, just having, red team testing, employee training, here's a lot of the savings right there. So and I think a lot of the attendees seen this ad nauseum because while we wait for Tom, I just had that going back and forth.
And Joanna, I think Joanna brought up a really good point. If you're a company, you need to know what your asset's worth. So know what you're protecting is the key point that I think you brought up, Joanna. If I've got some valuable asset, then I'm going to spend more money on the defense, as opposed to if I don't have as much value of the assets. So I think that's where the C-suites need to know what type of data and value that they have to put on their business, their reputation, but also on the data that they're protecting.
That's right. If I'm Pfizer or Moderna right now, I'm really worried about how much money I've invested in my cybersecurity.
Right.
Excellent. So we have another message here, a question here. This is from Mark Mayberry, who many of you know from Stanley Black & Decker, great guy, great supporter of our program. How do you argue for investment in cyber when typically within 3 months of a breach, publicly traded valuations often return to prior levels. For instance, Target. CISO or even the CEO might get fired, but shareholders don't seem to pay the price.
Well, that's potentially true, but I think that you don't actually hear about so many companies that completely go under. When I was a prosecutor at the Department of Justice, like I was aware of a company that had massive R&D. They'd spent massive R&D in a particular industry for 10 or 15 years, completely went under because of a cyber attack. I mean, so you don't always hear about the companies that don't stay viable because of that. And yes, you will have the Targets and the Sonys and the companies that can bounce back. But that's not going to be everybody. And it's kind of like playing Russian roulette at some point of like, am I just going to bargain on the fact that my company is the one that's going to survive? If I think when you're making the business case to C-suite, they're already thinking business. So it just should be one other business decision that they're making. And the risk reward benefit hopefully will make sense to them.
Right. And you only hear about the big ones, let's be honest, right? You don't hear about
right.
thousands of them that are out there. When we look at, the Verizon data breach report, the outline of the data behind it is 2,000 or 3,000 compared to the capital ones, the Ubers, and a handful of others you hear about.
Yeah, and Mark, I just saw your question. So the company that I referred to wasn't an R&D company. It was the fact that they had spent so much in R&D over a certain amount of time. They had so much capital tied up in their R&D expense that when their trade secrets were stolen, they got wiped out. So again, you don't hear about every single company. You don't hear about the mom and pop companies, but obviously, the operational damage can be significant. And when you just think about other, my kid's school district just got hit a couple weeks ago with a ransomware attack, and like all the school stuff went down for a week. So it's everybody's responsibility. If they're going to hit, K-12 school districts that have no money in the middle of COVID, it's easier for a bad actor to find a weak connection. So if your company has no cyber culture and no cyber hygiene and no policy, you're much more likely to be hit than a company that does.
Yeah, so on that, I'm going to go back here and then I'm going to take Peter's question because it ties in here. So what do we mean, like, in this goes, what do we talk about enterprise cybersecurity? Tom, what do we mean by enterprise cybersecurity? And I think this goes back to when you talked about everyone thinks of cybersecurity of, oh, here it is, it's all the techies, it's the IT department, or it's all siloed in the security operations center.
Yeah, so it's multi-layered, right? So the old days of the old world of information security, information risk, technology, IT, I mean, all of that's now being lumped into the cyber piece to make sure that from identity access, passwords, logging into applications, customer-facing applications, the ports that you're actually using to get into them, right? Protecting all of that. Very different. I mean, you can go either as techie as you want in an IT world from a cyber perspective, and you can go into the governance and the oversight and the policy, and they're both different spectrums when you look at it. But there's multi-layers. I mean, what used to be, Kevin, the true cyber folks, I kind of think of it, you're the lifeguard, right? But there's multiple people that on the beach that are there to save people's lives. So you have to think of people from healthcare all the way on. Healthcare is another good example where, you're protecting data in healthcare, and that data is so valuable. And who would think that in healthcare, a CISO is important, a CIO is important, and all of the data constrictions.
And you see that now out there too, across all the business units where you have the CISO. Now you have these BISOs, the business information security officer. They're like mini CISOs within governing each business unit.
Correct.
So go ahead, Joanne.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think it's really important to remind people or make sure that your company or your organization understands too, that it's not, the CISO is not independently responsible for security in an organization. I mean, it goes up and down, right? I mean, the CISO, you're going to get the great technical input and kind of how you provide it throughout the organization. But you need that buy-in, as we've talked about. You need to make sure that people actually legitimately, and then you need accountability and you need training, because you can have all the best systems in the world. You can have the best kind of cyber hygiene. You could spend the most money on it. And guess what? It takes one employee, like hitting on an email, and it still happens. It's so funny that in 2021, you're still talking about phishing, but it's
The biggest
exponentially
threat.
like increased. It is still the biggest threat. So you can have all that you want, but if you don't have buy-in from your employees, and I'm talking about any employee that has a company email, because it's that two-way street, right? Somebody comes in through email, and they definitely have some pretty good access. So if you don't have employee training and employee accountability and buy-in, and it's not their fault, you don't want to say, oh gosh, you terrible employee, like you clicked on a link. If they don't understand, what to look for, if they don't understand that, like, I just got an email and I should have actually looked at the address on it to see it's not actually from the president of the company. It says president of the company, but when I click on the email address, it actually says some gobbledygook. It's really important for employees, and part of the reason you need them to care. So in order to get them to care, you need to explain how it's going to impact them as an employee, as does. And so when I think of enterprise, I think of like all the way through, the CISO's kind of in the middle, but it takes the top and all the way down to the bottom.
Yeah, and I want to go back to Mark's question, which I thought you answered eloquently, Joanna, but another piece to that, no, you did, it was great. But Mark, there's another piece out there too, when you're making the case to the board, there's no interest like self-interest. And I always say that. And right now, the board members are threatened by this ransomware. It's no longer where they're just shutting down the business or they're taking the data. They're going after their personal data and then looking for things that, it might be something they don't want on the front page of the New York Times, and they're going to release that out there. So when you're making the case, you make it personal too, because that's what it is. And when you're dealing with employees as well, right? It's not like, hey, if you don't do this, you're going to get a reprimand. It's more, if you don't do this, we might be out of business, and then you're out of a job, right? And that now goes to Peter Salvetti's question. And Peter's the CTO at Boston College, one of our students, ready to graduate. So education, yes. The conundrum is these small businesses and or city-state governments do not have the necessary technical wherewithal to deal with this. So how do they protect themselves?
Well, on the technical side, I'm going to defer to Tom, but I would say even if you don't have a lot of investment, well, first of all, you can always hire someone to help you, right? Whether you're a small business or a large industry, there are all sorts of companies, consultants, cybersecurity professionals out there that will at least come in and do an audit, or worst case scenario, do your own audit. Like, again, what's your asset? What kind of information do you have? Who has access to it? Where do you keep it? And do you know the people that actually have access to it? And what kind of controls do you have on that? I mean, even the most basic things any small company can do, really, without a ton of technical expertise. Right. And then again, a lot of the basics like phishing and emails, like I'm sure any one of you could come up with a pretty easy training program and then do a live fire drill, as Tom said, send out a fake one and see how many people actually click on the link. But as far as like a lot of the technical capabilities, I'm going to kick it back over to you, Tom. I'm sure you have some great ideas.
So that's where I think, to be honest with you, for those who are looking for a job or how to create a business, this is what's missing in the industry. I truly believe it. So there's small companies from a technology perspective, they need a company that can actually do this, right? So, if they could go to a third party and kind of put everything through this platform and have that platform be compliant with regulations and all the cybersecurity and tools, because these smaller companies can't go out and buy Akamai. They're not going to have some peripheral type of bot detection because they're a small company. And when you look at some of the expectations that are out there from an industry perspective, I think that they're actually having kind of a challenge. And they're saying, hey, I can't afford all of the tools that are necessary for me to compete with some of these bigger guys. That third party, Joanna, is kind of that group that's really needed in some of that IT perspective.
Yeah, and one piece here too, back to Peter's question, it's the risk reduction, right? We're not expecting, if you're a small business, a small city government, you're not going to have the same security that the Pentagon has or that State Street Bank has or that John Hancock Manulife. And oh, by the way, we didn't start off with this because Tom was late, but anything Tom is saying right now is in his own personal capacity and not on behalf of John Hancock and Manulife.
I think I kind of said that in the beginning just to make sure, because I take
no, good. I want to make that clear too. So it's really risk reduction, right? So what, the money you have, the size of your business, and the information you're trying to protect, how can you reduce that risk? Because, the bad folks are going after the low hanging fruit. That's what they're looking for. So whatever you can do to reduce the risk, you do that, and a lot of it has, like what Joanna talked about and Tom, it doesn't have to be all that overly expensive. It's going to cost you, but you do it within your budget and your means. So I have another question here, and then we'll go into making the business case. So this one's from Carolyn. Carolyn's with PwC now, another former student. With so many organizations going to the cloud, how would you advise entities to help them understand their responsibility to continue to protect the data? That going to the cloud does not absolve the entity. Okay, Tom, you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people think when I outsource, I have to transfer my risk exposure, and I've transferred everything. I think that it's key to document who's accountable and who's responsible whenever you're outsourcing anything. Because if you don't, I think you're going to end up in a situation, Carolyn, where you're pointing finger, and then you're going to get into that legality issue.
Yeah, and going to the cloud, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden you're transferring your security responsibilities to somebody else. You're transferring your data to somewhere else that makes it more accessible and hopefully more secure. That does not mean that your organization all of a sudden does not have a responsibility, as Tom said. So I think it's a misnomer, and just sometimes migrating to the cloud can cause a lot of there's a lot of vulnerabilities there. So I think that's something that you need to educate your C-suite. And I did see another question, and I'm just going to answer this really quickly because I think it seems to go along. But there was a question of, what was the most difficult, C-suite executive, or what issue came up in terms of trying to convince them. And I would say typically it's because the C-suite is not educated. They have a much different idea about what either the company's responsibilities are, what type of data we have, or what the threats and the risks are out there. So I think most times it comes down to making sure that they really are educated and they understand the reality of what they're dealing with. And then maybe you can sell them on what the appropriate investment is in your cybersecurity.
And back to the cloud too, on the liability, what you're doing by moving it to the cloud, it could be more secure than you having it at your home office. But the key here, it's the cost, right? Securing, having, and protecting your own networks is a lot of money. So now this is a cost reduction, but the risk stays the same, right? And that's the thing to understand. And also what Joanna hammered home is the liability. So if I shift everything up to AWS and I'm a big company and there's a breach there, guess what? The liability comes back to me. It doesn't go, I might have a case against AWS, but everyone else, shareholders and people whose information I have, they have a case against me, and the regulators are coming after me as well. So that's a good point.
Yeah, it's still my data. It's still my data. It may be held somewhere else, but it's still my data and I'm responsible for it. One other thing I was going to throw out there that we kind of forget, sorry, Tom, and then I'll pass it back to you, is so the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Agency through DHS, CISA, they have been coming out with a lot of really good guidance lately. They have a great website. So again, for companies that maybe don't have the internal sources, there are a lot of really good external resources. And I think one of our participants actually put up some really good references too for different industry specific organizations that provide a lot of information on very specific threats, and then just kind of some basic cyber hygiene.
Can I just add about the cloud piece? So there's the other aspect of resiliency, and you can't forget that. So if you did have some type of an event, a breach or something, you've got resiliency with the cloud because you can then transfer very quickly and recover quicker than if you had to do it on your own and try and rebuild your infrastructure. So keep that in mind as you're looking at cloud as a solution.
Yeah, and we have Peter's question I'll get to real quick, and then I'm going to shift right to how we make the case. How do we do that? So Peter has here the difference between threat actors and everyone else is that threat actors remember, all caps, so he's screaming at his laptop right now, where they remember where the vulnerabilities are. How does a mature organization be educated in these respects? So I guess it's really, how do you get hit by career bad guys who are attacking you. They know the vulnerabilities. What do you do to protect yourself going further? And I think the answer is, and Tom, you can jump in too, I saw you shaking your head, is you got to be transparent, and then you got to make sure those vulnerabilities are taken care of. You don't just keep moving along. It's like, hey, we're hit, and then not learn from your past mistakes. You got to patch those up and take care of them. What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, so I think, to be honest with you, the root cause, that post-mortem root cause is key in every type of event that you have. Because if you don't start looking at each one of those, you're just going to repeat history constantly.
Excellent. All right. So now I'm going to get to, okay, so we just set the table. We know what the risks are. We answered some questions. How do you make the case? How do you do it? Especially, I really, making the case to the C-suite. Okay, that's important. You have to get the buy-in from the top. Let's talk about how do we get the employees to buy in? How do you get the receptionist? How do you get the paralegal? How do you get, the analyst? How do you get the vice president of sales who's just trying to make sales to buy into cybersecurity? Because all we know is cybersecurity is not something, he's thinking or she's thinking of. So how do you do this?
So can I jump in just initially?
Yeah,
so
go for it.
I think it's really easier now, believe it or not, than it was 3 years ago, 4 years ago.
Maybe 3
Because
months ago.
everybody thought it's not going to happen to me, right? It's not going to happen. There's no chance of it ever happening. And as people are seeing the data leaks that are happening, the impacts to large financial institutions, healthcare, it's hitting retail, it's hitting every aspect of the industries. So I think that as that's happening, you've got C-suites, again, they're focusing on, I want to keep my job too. So they're hearing about the Ubers and everyone else who are hiding stuff and getting walked out. And they're looking at, what's my responsibility? And how do I make sure that I'm in tune and connected on the responsibility that I have to protect data? And that I'm raising my hand and going forward, and I'm putting through the program. So let's talk some of the regs if we can. Like the New York Department of Financial Services, right? CCPA, GDPR. I mean, they're putting the ownership, New York Department of Financial Services, putting the ownership on the CISO to attest that they have a cyber program. When did that happen? Like 2 years ago, right?
So Tom, go this way. Okay, that's great. I understand that. Joanna understands that. Well, pretend now I'm just some administrator. I'm at home. It's the middle of COVID. I'm working in my home office, which really is my kitchen table. I don't know what the GDPR is. I don't know what any of these regulations are, what you're talking about. It sounds great, but why should I care about cybersecurity? I'm at home. I'm just trying to do my job. How do you get me to buy into it?
Yeah, so I think the best way to get them to buy in is training, but the training is to show them the value add. If we were hit and we had a reputational issue, number one, you personally could be terminated or prosecuted. But in addition to that, I might not have a company to go back to. So, to Joanna's point earlier, how many companies haven't made it through? And I'm the receptionist, but if I don't have a company to go to every day, where am I going to go look for a job during COVID because we had some type of a reputational hit or a data loss?
So Joanna, why don't you walk me through it? Tell me how I'm going to be secure and why I should do it.
So, I mean, I think part of it is cyber is just, it's with us and it's here to stay. And so I totally agree with Tom that it is probably easier to make a case now than it has been before. Simply because it's not, you can't just look at cyber as just some piece of your security. It's the way you do business. It's the way you operate your company or your organization. It has to be a part of everything that you do. And so I think that's really, so from the beginning, like when you're onboarding your employees, like having a cyber policy in place that talks about this is really important. We can't stay in business. We can't function properly. You can't work from home, by the way, if we don't have a good cyber policy and if people aren't following it. So if you can't come into work, you may not have a job. So, part of it is just really making sure that importance and weaving in, that cyber is just part of how we do our jobs every day. That's really important. And then, of course, as Tom said, it's training, because it doesn't necessarily, just because someone sees about cyber breaches in the news or they hear about them all the time, or maybe they don't, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to bring it home to them doing their job. So I think talking about the specific, what do you do in your job? Like, what is our organization? Again, going back to the assets, it's easy, to convince somebody probably that works for Pfizer and Moderna, but maybe not as easy to convince somebody in a different business. So make it relevant to them. Like, why do we need to protect our data? And then how does that affect you? Or how does that affect your kids on the outside when they're growing up with social media and all of a sudden all their information is out there potentially on the dark web? So it's, maybe even weaving in at this point, maybe it's time where people actually can see the civic responsibility. And kids do, like kids are getting all the education in schools and stuff. So, again, trying to make it that culture, but it's training at least once a quarter. You can't do it once a year.
And it has to be targeted, and it has to be something, and you can tell me where I'm wrong on this, and or you agree on Tom and Joanna. when you're doing it, it's not there, you're not there to scare. I talked about going to the board and saying there's no interest, like self-interest. You want to tell them like, hey, here's the threat, but then like, here's what we can do to mitigate it. It's not all is lost, because if it's all is lost, what do I care? I'll take the risk. We'll just move forward. If we get hit, we're going to get hit anyways. It's more, here's what's out there and this is what we need to do. And then it's talking their language so they understand it. And that's why I was jokingly saying like the GDPR, what are you talking about? Like, tell me like, why do you have to do this? Because if I don't pay attention to this stuff, here's the consequences, like people's sensitive information, their intellectual property, things along those lines are gone. Yep. Go ahead, Tom. I see you.
So I think that that's an important piece, right? Because I don't think that we're paying enough attention to, there are folks, the receptionist, who doesn't even know really what the definition of cybersecurity is. Mm-hmm. It's this unknown, right? And breaking it down so that people understand. I mean, again, I'm an old guy, right? Back years ago, it was clear desk policy. That's what cybersecurity.
Yeah.
Protecting data was. Make sure that you don't have a fax on your desk when you leave for the day, right? Now it's very different, but that was, 30 years ago, that was our cybersecurity program. Make sure your desk is clean. And make sure the fax machine and the copy machine, and don't leave things around, right? And now it's just very different. It's all digital, and people are looking at that differently. But for the older folks, a lot of people don't think or don't know exactly what that definition is. And I think helping them understand and peeling it back to exactly what cyber is and how they can impact it is key, or else we're never going to move the needle. Because I think Joanna mentioned it's from the bottom up, right? And we need to make sure
that's how you have to. Right. And it's, really, I use that example. I'm at home at my kitchen table, but I'm my own security officer. Reality, right? I have my own personal Wi-Fi. I have my printer. I might be talking on the phone. I'm in the kitchen, and I'm talking about sensitive information that anyone who's around in my kitchen can hear it, right? Am I on a VPN? Like, there's all so many things. So I guess, when you look at that, how do you make that real? And I think that's something that comes from now you need like not only the top, but you need the business units who stop pushing it down to their people who work with you. And maybe you can talk about how that goes right now when you're dealing with that.
Yes. So I think that even like with the whole phishing piece, right? Mm-hmm. Knowing who failed phishing when we're doing training, and then who the repeat offenders are. Those repeat offenders. So some people are just curious. They click everything, right? That's all they do. They click everything. Rewarding the people who are actually stopping it, having them be your cybersecurity champions, acknowledging them, and having them start to, foster that camaraderie with other employees and colleagues, so that everyone's always thinking from a security perspective and from a risk perspective. That's key.
Yeah, and actually, I'm so glad you mentioned that, Tom, because that is really important. It's one thing not to click on something and just, move on with your day and you're like, yeah, I knew that. But really, the IT department and your C-suite and the rest of your colleagues don't know about it unless you're proactive and say, hey guys, I just, I just got an email. I didn't click on it, but I know it was a phishing email. So really, yeah, promoting that proactivity among your colleagues and your employees is really important. And it's kind of a feel good. It's like, hey, maybe I just saved our company from bankruptcy because no one was able to get in and get the goods. So, and I just saw one of the comments. I think Jane said that they that was a great. That's great that her IT department sent out phishing emails, and tons of people ended up clicking on it. Within a month, everyone was much more sensitive about it. So, having a little bit of that, that live fire, that, the fire, there's a reason why we do fire drills, right? In schools and other organizations, is so people remember what to do. So that is a good way to kind of keep people accountable.
And what's great about that too is, it's targeted, but also you want to target the employees too. Not meaning like, hey, we're going to go after Joanna Baltus this time. It's more, how you train the receptionist and how you train the analyst and how you train the general counsel's office is completely different. This one size fit all doesn't work, and it can't be the training of, hey, here's the 2-hour training, check the box compliance, now go watch it. And what happens, and you have it on your laptop playing it, on your work laptop playing, and then you're on your personal computer doing your work that we don't want you on your personal computer because there's a workaround, right? We got to make it real and focused. And okay, we have another question.
Can I just plug the FBI for a second?
Yes.
FBI.gov. I love my FBI friends, right? FBI.gov has a great game for kids who are grade school, to teach them what to do and what not to do online. and it's in an interactive, fun kind of way, and they're playing a game. But I highly recommend it. We recommend it during Cybersecurity Awareness Month for folks to bring home. But that starts the culture ahead of time, right? So that they're in grade school and they're starting to learn how to be aware of online predators and how to keep and safeguard their data.
Yeah, and on that one, go ahead, Joanne, then I'll jump in.
I was just going to say, there's a question on what else to look out for in emails. So always look at, just because, don't just look at the name on the email address, actually hover over it. Don't click on, hover over it and see what it says, because I've been spammed so many times where people have tried to take over my identity, email somebody else and say, can you go buy me an Amazon gift card for $100? And I mean, I've had to have done that. I'm like, did you actually see, did you hover over the email to see? Hover over the attachment, any kind of a link, hover over and see what happens. And then also bad grammar and weird subject lines. I think someone pointed out like little asterisks in the subject line. That's usually some sign that something weird. And then it just doesn't sound right. It's like there's something just off about the email. And I think that's really the most thing. If it doesn't sound right, like don't click on it. Just pick up the phone and call that person.
and if you do click, don't be embarrassed. Everyone does it. Tell somebody. And some people think if I click it and nothing really happened, my computer didn't do anything weird, it didn't smoke, then I don't have to worry about it. But the malware is still going there, even if it doesn't look like anything happened.
Yeah, and now we have a question from Peter, and really I'll sum it real up. It's really talking about like, hey, most boards that you deal with, they don't have the technical expertise really to understand cyber, and how do you get around that, or how do you teach, or what do you do? And it really comes to you have to speak, in plain language to them. Come in and say, this is what we're doing. This is why we need it. This is how it works, but do it in a plain, easily understandable manner. Like if you were sitting down and having coffee with me at Dunkin' Donuts or wherever, if we weren't in COVID, and you're explaining something to me and I don't understand what you're talking about, but you want me to understand. So it's plain language. That's how you do it. If you go into a board, and Tom, you can talk to this, and Joanna, you can do it, especially as a board member. If you go in there and just start talking about things that they don't understand, they're either going to be tuned out and not pay attention, or they're going to be pretty upset, and you don't want either. So what do you think, Tom?
I think it's just a simple statement: know your audience, right? It really is just know your audience. What's important to them? Some audience, it's financial, some it's reputation. Just know what's important to them and speak to them about what's important. And that's how you're going to get your message across. And that's how you're going to get buy-in, because you got to get that sponsor. You have to have someone really back you up in getting all of this done. And that's key and important. Someone's got to have some money. They've got to have the power, the decision-making ability, but they also have to be able to understand what you're speaking about.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see, here's another question come in from Christina, and then I move back to Peter's, like super active. Do you see more boards adding cyber experts as board members? Our board is standing up a separate cyber committee, has a cyber update at audit committee. To answer that quickly, yes. I think the expertise is needed. And typically if someone has the cyber expertise, it depends who you're getting in. You don't want to just have a technologist on there. I don't think that's going to be helpful, but you'd want someone who has a holistic understanding of not only cybersecurity, but the business units, the privacy concerns, and how it works back and forth. That's what you would want. That's what I would see for a board.
I'm also seeing in the industry that a lot of boards are paying for a cyber group to come in and do a cyber audit on companies, just to make sure that they've got that better rigor. And it also shows that they have a proactive approach to it, so that they put some vesting and some money into it, and have a group come in, do an audit on the team, and align it to one of the regs. It could be the SEC, it could be one of the New York Department of Financial Services, or CCP.
And the training to the boards too. I see a lot of that where you're coming in, like they have the training to the boards, and then they have, actually the board will have its own expert consultant on cyber,
right?
That reports directly to the board.
Right.
That's one there. And all right, so hey, we're getting close to time. So let's go here. What tips do you have, for folks who are working at, like businesses that have everyone working at home? What simple tips do you have for them to help them be more cyber secure?
Well,
and don't say bring them back to work, because we can't.
No, I mean, if you have a VPN, that is definitely one of the best things that you can do for your home office employees. You can, I mean, that definitely gives you that added layer of protection. It's pretty easy to go to like some type of a multi-factor authentication for your passwords. Honestly, passwords are still don't use a word in your password, use a passphrase. Passwords are notoriously annoying to employees. I mean, when I was with the federal government, I had 3 computers, depending on whether it was classified, secret, or top secret. I had a combination to my safe. I had 50 million passwords, and I worked at national security, and I would still write them down every once in a while. Don't tattle on me. But the point is, like, you have to make it easy for people. You need to come up with easy ways for them to use a good password that's not easily crackable, that's not, you can't run a dictionary program again and pick it out. So password, really coming up with good, making sure that they're changing their password often, which I know is annoying to employees, but it is one of kind of the basic things that you can do. VPN from home, that's definitely very helpful. Making sure that you're on a secure Wi-Fi, don't hotspot off someone else's Wi-Fi. Don't go to your local Starbucks because, obviously it's COVID and that's probably not a good place to hang out anywhere, or Dunkin' Donuts, but don't use public Wi-Fi. Don't use public Wi-Fi.
Totally.
Tom, what do you got?
No, I gotta be honest, I think, Joanna, you hit everyone. The other thing is just, I think about the people factor, because, I'm an IT guy, so people and paper, my 2 P words that I don't like. So people, making sure that if you're cohabitating with someone, if you're in an apartment building, that you're keeping your conversations quiet, that you're not, sharing that information. Headsets are key. I would do, headsets to make sure that you're keeping quiet. And again, Alexa, shut her off. She doesn't need to hear all of your conversations and all of your conference calls and recording all of the information.
And use a password. I think Jane asked, use an app that is a password device for you, because when you start thinking about the number of passwords you have, from like your healthcare to your Jimmy John's order to your Nordstrom's account to your whatever it is that you have in addition to all your work things, it really is difficult to kind of keep track of that. So there's some great apps out there. There's Password Vault, there's 1Password, there's LastPass. There's so many out there now where you have a master password, and then everything else you can access through your app. Yeah. And that works across multiple devices. So
and my advice to the business units or the security policy makers for your company, don't put in requirements that people won't follow, which you think are great, they're so stringent, and you don't work with the business units, and everyone finds a workaround that. You want to keep people focused. If we want you using your work devices, but you make it so hard for them to get their job done, everyone's going to jump on their personal devices or their home laptops, and you don't know where that thing is. You have the kids on there, you have family members. So make sure they make sense, and make sure if you're the CISO or you work in that group, you work with the business units to get things secure. And you explain to them, there might be some things you can get rid of that might not work for either, but there's sometimes it's like, we have to do this because if we don't, our business operations are going to go down.
Right.
All right.
And it's really, I was gonna say one last thing. It's really important to review your policies. Just because you put in a policy a couple of years ago doesn't mean you still need that policy. It may have unintended consequences that are actually worse for you than like what you had previously. So make sure you're reviewing those with your business units to make sure that it's not making it so difficult for people that they are coming up with those workarounds. You've got to be practical on what you're actually going to ask your employees to do. And don't rely on insurance. I did see one other question out there. If your C-suite thinks that your cyber insurance is going to save you from not doing anything, they should go ahead and read the fine print of their insurance policy. So they'll either get dropped from their insurance policy because the insurance company will find out that they didn't even do the basics, or it'll still be very expensive and it won't be covered. So that's
with
definitely
the model,
not
the model instructions and requirements for insurance. It's pretty much requiring, if you want the insurance, you have to do all of these frameworks put in place, that if you can't do that, you're not going to be covered at all. So, Tom, what's your what questions did I not ask that I should have asked that you want to answer?
I think we covered a lot of ground here, to be honest with you. And I'm kind of okay right now with everything we covered.
Yeah. How about you, Joanna? What did I miss?
Yeah, I don't think you missed much, and I feel like I'm back in court, speed speaking, and try to cover as much ground in an hour. But hopefully, hopefully everyone got some at least one or two good tips
Yeah, so
today.
with that, I want to thank Tom. Thanks for taking the time, and all teasing aside, it was fantastic as always, and it's always a pleasure. And Joanna, great job. It was great having you, and thanks for taking the time to participate in the panel as well. And for all of you out there, we're going to have our next panel in March. So on March 25th, we're going to have a panel on healthcare security, and we have Scott Lashway, who's the co-chair of the cyber and privacy group from Nat Phelps and Phillips, big law firm here in Boston. He's also the managing partner of the Boston office. And then Tim Stateman, who is with the College of Healthcare Information Management Executives. So that's going to be a really cool one. And then we also have the Boston Conference on Cybersecurity. More to come on that. That's our big conference that we do with the FBI. And this year it's going to be virtual. So once we get things set up, you're all welcome to sign up, and we look forward to seeing you there. So with that, thanks for your time, and go Eagles. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
See ya.
Oh.